The idea that like you are only worth what you contribute to the GDP. Well, so how does that relate to the work of caretaking? Obviously, it is very openly devaluing the work of anybody who chooses to at home with their children, for example. And yet there are so many things we could say about what this is worth. Like, what kind of education are my children getting at home from a homeschooling parent? You can't put a number on it. That obviously, like my husband and I think it is priceless.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Nadya Williams. We're discussing her book, Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. This conversation happened really quick. This was one where I think she may just have a lot of experience doing interviews because she had really good answers and the conversation moved quicker than I'm used to. I usually just kind of prepare myself to burrow in. But this one, yeah, it happened a lot faster. And by the time I realized, wow, we're coming up on a time I need to start to pay attention to how much, I need to start paying attention to finishing things. It just seems so fast. I know the promise is long form conversation, so I'll try to get better at that. I won't get caught off guard quite so much anymore. I want to prep you for this interview. I want to take a moment to discuss unconditional love. And I've been mulling this over since this interview, because of this interview, but also because of this interview, which was recorded 3 December 2024. But also because of something that happened the next day. So 4 December 2024, for those of you listening far into the future, fingers crossed on that. On that day, Brian Thompson was murdered. While I neither want to cast my lot nor the point of view of this podcast behind the endorsement of that murder, I very much want to point out that acknowledging a murder as an unjust and wicked and violent act, reducing human life and human beings to actuarial tables, or evaluating their importance on the basis of profits made, extracting monetary value from human life, is very much something that I wanted to avoid. And it's an exclamation point on a sentence or an interrobang on a question that I had several times throughout this interview. Is value discourse helpful, or does it diminish the conversation when we talk about human beings? And to her credit, Nadya acknowledged that it is limiting, that many of the words that we use to talk about importance or significance or love in general, or to understand how and why we're supposed to love, are tools that exist in our toolbox largely from a commercial standpoint. Because of Brian Thompson's murder back in December 2024, but also a lot of other conversations that are happening in the United States that are attempting to get at what it is to love. What does it mean to love? What is the responsibility incumbent on someone who claims to love? I think, reduced, in addition to the definition that I give in this podcast, which is love is changing dirty diapers, I would add, if you get an opportunity to love someone, you should love them. Doing things for others, giving things to others, being materially responsible for others, being vulnerable to others. These are all characteristics of love. And I hope that in the macro, that conversation can happen. And I hope that specifically on this podcast, we can continue to have that conversation. It is a difficult case to make, to say that I don't necessarily want to limit this essentially Bible podcast to religious points of view. That is a difficult case to make. That said, I don't want to limit this podcast to religious points of view. I do think that they are the most prepared to talk about love. but that does not mean that they are the most qualified to talk about love. And so I will say, if you're listening to this, whether you're on Patreon or you're listening for free, you're watching on YouTube, you're watching on TikTok, whatever, if you have suggestions for someone that you think, whether they engage with biblical texts or not, if you have a suggestion for me of a guest in someone who can articulate love in a way that is applicable to contemporary civic, political, commercial, economic life, I would love to talk to that person. So reach out to me at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. If you're on Patreon, hit me up there. You guys can throw comments and you can start conversations with me that way. You can also hit me up across social media. I am on Twitter. I am on Blue Sky. I am on Facebook. I am on Spoutable, which, by the way, let me call it out. That is a small and relatively, it seems, unknown social media platform. Look that up and look me up on there and give me a follow. And please give me any feedback on what I may or may not be doing, well or poorly. I will leave you with what I reduce things down to, which is if you get an opportunity to love someone, you should love them. Now, here's my conversation with Nadya Williams. Nadya Williams, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I was an academic for 15 years, taught ancient history and classics at a state university in Georgia. And then a year and a half ago, I walked away from academia to write for the church and homeschool my kids and all the good stuff.
Yeah, the kids are the good stuff.
Yeah, they are.
Which I want to say up top, and I hope this makes sense to the listeners, but I'm not really that concerned in the end. Listening to your book, I am the baby bunny. That was
Oh,
me. That was me as
okay.
a little boy.
Oh, that's
So
sweet.
maybe maybe we'll get to explain that. If we don't,
Yes.
that's okay. We'll share it, and they won't have it. So diving right in, we're going to be discussing your book, Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. So I prefer to begin with a positive assertion. I know you do spend a lot of the front end of this book, I think, maybe tackling some things with which you disagree, and that's fine. That's your prerogative. I prefer to hear, okay, so what is it that you are asserting? And then we can deal with the other stuff if you want.
Kids are good, and people are God's like delight, that God really loves us. And even though, the creation is fallen, creation is groaning, and yet God delights in every single person who has ever existed. Just crazy.
So that's where you want to, okay. Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't
Yeah.
cut you off.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I don't know if I included this in the email. I asked the first question and I try to follow where you go from there. So I will not treat the questions like a checklist. But Imago Dei is what we're talking about here. And so I'll say unconditional love. Can we start by talking about that? Because you're talking about love. I really like talking about unconditional love, and I would love to hear more. Can you put some more meat on those bones for us?
Yes, and it's one of those things. By the way, those anyone who's written a book knows the publishers will change your original title. But I think my original title actually helps to answer this question a little bit. So my original title was priceless. Just the idea that every single person in God's eyes is priceless. So it's not just about love, but actually economics get into it. Part of my concern is that today, a lot of times, we think of people as goods. So instead of God's economy, where every single person ever created is good, is God's delight, today we have this idea of people as goods that we can price. So, for example, insurance companies have kind of ways of figuring out, like, how much are you worth if you die? I mean, that's the whole idea of a life insurance policy, for example, to get really grim right off the bat. Sorry. Um, but just in general, the idea that in God's economy, there's no way to price any of us. We're priceless, and God really loves his creation. Um, This is not to say we're perfect. Obviously, we're not. We're fallen, we're sinful, and yet God delights in us. But in the secular economy, there is a way of kind of hierarchy, and that has always been a part of human societies. And what I'm talking about in this book is how we see this conflict between Christian values, the value of how God sees creation, how God sees people. Um, and how the secular world thinks about these goods as kind of goods with like lowercase g as opposed to something good with a uppercase g. And so what I wanted to focus on in this book is how our society treats motherhood, mothers and children as kind of goods that maybe like are a little too expensive for us. And where does it get us? And so my point is that the way our society talks about mothers and children is a canary in the mine in thinking of how our society treats people more generally. And one of the stories that I briefly bring up in this book, but it's been in the news more recently, is conversations in other countries around euthanasia. So just a few days ago, as we're speaking, Britain has legalized euthanasia, which I see as the other side of this coin. The question of what are people for? Are some people more valuable than others? And if you say yes, some people are more valuable than others, it opens the door to all kinds of ethically disturbing implications. At least ethically disturbing for Christians, and that's where the language of Imago Dei, that people are priceless because we're all made in God's image, um, that's where it makes the difference.
As I was working my way, or as someone was reading your book to me, a thing that I was thinking of was with regard to this, so assisted suicide. I think a thing that maybe we don't understand, and we have an opportunity in this country from the opioid crisis, is the extent to which life is suffering and how much pain there is in life, and it should expose that to us. So like, you're not asserting an attempt to deliver pain mitigation in a different way, but how do you address its legitimate pain? Actually, sorry, backing up. I remember learning watching the show House that not all addicts are lying about the pain that they're in to get pain medications, for example. So with real legitimate pain, where does that fit into an ethic of human life? I'll stop rambling.
I think that's a great question, and it's something that is a major misunderstanding, or perhaps a misunderstanding of convenience in some cases. Catholic theologian Charlie Camosi has written about it in quite some detail, and he has argued that a lot of times, whenever people say, like, "Oh, this person needs to be put out of their pain," like we're giving them a way out, and he looks especially at how people talk like this about children with disability, like children in utero, but also just people with disabilities. And what studies have found is that people with disabilities have a much better quality of life than we give them credit for. And so that goes for pain, that goes for all kinds of things. If you ask somebody who is in pain, most of the time they will actually say, like, I love life. I don't love my pain, but life is good. Uh, and even for those who are in horrific pain, most of the time, unless you catch them at their absolute worst moments, they will say, I choose life. So I think those conversations about quality of life really get at quality of healthcare. And the most heartbreaking stories about assisted suicide in places like Canada, but also in Europe, have been around people who are unable to get quality healthcare because of various problems with the healthcare system. That's devastating.
It certainly is, and I don't know. What about the people for whom the pain is too great? Like, what then?
Well, again, like the point is human beings are priceless. Like we should not, it is not up to us to say let's put somebody out of their misery.
No, I'm not. So I'm not arguing that. I'm
Mhm.
saying because on the ground, I have lived with people. I have
Mhm.
known people who have or are suffered from pain that is relentless,
Hmm.
in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah.
And I'm not asking, how should I solve that? I'm
Hmm.
saying, is there an understanding or a principle that can help us approach that, not necessarily to correct it? Is
Hmm.
there encouragement? Is that, like, do you see what I'm saying?
Mm.
It's such a fuzzy area. Like, for example, so a friend of mine from high school, I remember finding out he committed suicide 8 years ago. He committed suicide, and I remember being furious with him. But when I found out as a father that he had children, and I was angry and sad and hurt, but I didn't know why he had done it until I traveled to the memorial and I heard his family say, well, there was this medical condition and the pain wouldn't end. I don't want to find a way to justify his taking his life. What I want to know is, if I come across that, how do I articulate what you're saying beyond value, I guess?
I think this is a good question, and I like the way you phrased it because you are assuming that any kind of answers lie in community. Despair dwells in isolation, and hope, even in the most horrific pain, lies in community. And that's where the local church, for example, can help. That's where family can really rally around somebody who is suffering. The other thing to keep in mind is that the 20th, 21st century, like we're only, a century or so into a world where we can assume that we'd like to assume that we are entitled to a pain-free life. I mean, just think about it. Antibiotics are only like a century old. Um, a lot of medical advances that we take for granted did not exist up until very recently. And so, for the vast majority of human existence, people have dwelt with a much greater degree of daily pain and discomfort than we are willing to tolerate. And I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that our pain doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is that we should treasure people in the midst of that. And that's something that early Christians thought about a lot with martyrdom. Um, so for some of us, maybe we are like some people are called to life with chronic pain. And I wish that were not the case. And yet, does it mean that their life is any less valuable than somebody else's? Like your life is still a treasure. You are still a treasure in God's eyes, regardless of your health status. And that's where Christianity has something very different to say in the dialogue. Whereas the secular solution would be like, well, if you get to a certain like threshold, maybe your life is not worth living. And I think we really need to fight that sort of darkness because that is a slippery slope, a sliding scale of unspeakable horrors. So one novel I keep coming back to in my book is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where there is mandatory euthanasia once people get to a certain age. Like, your middle age is like, that's about as far as anybody should live. After that, your body starts falling apart. You're going to be a burden on society. We're putting you out of it. And I don't want us ever to get there. Uh, and yet, for people who don't have a framework of treasuring all life, even people who are suffering, there is that solution. Because let's not kid ourselves. So often, it really is about the convenience of others. And I don't know the circumstances, obviously, of your high school friend. And it's really tragic that this happened. But I do think about support networks.
I'd love
Yeah.
to talk about Aldous
Hmm.
Huxley all day, but we're here to talk about your book. But putting a pin in that, so are you familiar with the book Colossians Remixed? It's
No.
over 20 years old now. Okay. So one of the things they do early on in that book is they call out that they're going to avoid the language of buying in. And,
Mm.
and I thought of that because we're
Mm.
talking about value
Yeah.
things. So is the discourse of value harmful to the overall point that you're trying to make and the centrality of the Imago Dei?
I think so. Yes, because whenever we try to put a number on something, it becomes objective, like sort of it becomes an object rather than a person. Instead of seeing the person, God's priceless image bearer in front of you, suddenly you see dollar signs for like, here's what this person is worth if they live or if they die, which is a really gruesome way to think about people. But ultimately, again, in so many aspects of modern life, especially insurance, this is how we are evaluated.
I think that question of worth, that's also come up in in public discourse lately, and it's been a thing that's kind of been unsettling to me in trying to understand why and how you might love someone. And the why is, well, I have determined that I am going to love this person, not necessarily that I get anything in return from that. But then retribution is really difficult to avoid. And I think a lot of people have an idea of worthiness of benefit for themselves or those they see like them, and worthiness of retribution for those they see as other. Do you see that playing in here at all too? It doesn't really come up in the book, to be fair.
Absolutely. That was definitely something that I was thinking about because, for instance, conversations around stay at home parents. I've heard repeatedly people on both uh, the Democrat and the Republican side of the aisle say things like, if you're not contributing to the GDP, that's a problem. Um, so the idea that like you are only worth what you contribute to the GDP. Well, so how does that relate to the work of caretaking? Obviously, it is very openly devaluing the work of anybody who chooses to stay at home with their children, for example. And yet there are so many things we could say about what this is worth. Like, what kind of education are my children getting at home from a homeschooling parent? You can't put a number on it. And yet, obviously, like my husband and I think it is priceless.
I've heard multiple conversations. I will credit him. Ezra Klein has had several people in the last couple of years on his podcast to discuss what is projected to be a caretaker deficit in our economy. And so they have been able to quantify where we're going to need that. And I it sounds like we would almost benefit from extending that out and adding to the measure of GDP and GMP and things like that, what our objectives are, what our purpose is, what our intent is, whether we're speaking as, like, so Christians having a conversation among themselves, how they want to engage in the public, or the public engaging broadly. So, is there a way to articulate that to say, hey, we could add this on to GDP as a measure, but it would have to have specific intentions and outcomes, right?
I think that's a great question, and I'm not qualified to talk about it. But a good friend of mine, Ivana Greco, is working on a book on homemakers as kind of like this invisible backbone of American society. So that's exactly the kind of questions she's asking, and she's a lawyer. Oh, she was a Harvard trained lawyer who stepped out of the profession to homeschool her kids during the pandemic because she realized that like her time was needed at home. And so it's very much that kind of story, and she is obviously qualified to talk about it and like the tangible policies that we need to help, because the reality is the caretaking crisis is hitting both in caring for the elderly and in caring for the youngest. So you have it on both ends of life, which is a good reminder that we need to, like, this is going to be all of us. So whenever we talk about what is your value as a person, are you contributing to the GDP, the reality is that all of us begin life with about like 2 decades when we do not contribute to the GDP, children. And then we have, like, the Lord willing, if we're blessed with a long life, we're going to have maybe 2 decades at the end of life when we're not contributing to the GDP. And the question is always like, are those lives valuable?
And it's certainly, I think, a little bit more straightforward with children, even though people still are not that interested in talking about that it is controversial to provide free lunches and meals to children is beyond me.
Yeah.
But educating children, like, there is a clear financial and economic benefit to that. However, it is a little bit more difficult to talk about the utilitarian um, benefits of caring for the elderly. So, are there specifics that you would point to say, not policies, but I guess, like, reasoning that you would say, like, hey, this should be a part of political discourse because, and then go.
So if you think back to antiquity, there was this idea that old age is valued, and we've kind of lost that a lot of times. We don't think about this perspective that old age brings wisdom, but it really does. I look at my church, who is serving more than anyone else, is contributing to things like Sunday school, especially for kids, people who are just offering their wisdom in all kinds of like precious, precious ways. It is the beauty of saints who have lived those decades, whose bodies may be falling apart and they're going from appointment to medical appointment. And yet they are the greatest blessing to God's people right now, precisely because they've lived all those decades. And we are so immeasurably blessed to have them with us. And that's the thing, you can't put a number on it, like you said. It's this intangible almost wisdom of old age that I think we need to learn. It seems like we need to relearn to treasure that as a society because we have this arrogance. Maybe it's the result of like technology boom and all that, but we feel like we know everything we need to know because factually, you literally can look up any fact you want and have it at your fingertips in seconds. And yet there's still something priceless that a lifetime of wisdom brings.
I think the gradient of humanity has always skewed away from
Mm.
kindness. And not to say that people are not capable of it, not to say that they've never demonstrated it, but to think in grand narrative, after World War II, there was a departure from human history. If you won wars prior to that, the people you just beat experienced extractive punishment of their natural resources or their economy. And so I think there is at least the narrative that you can point to say doing things in the interest of something greater than simply making money. That's not to say that nobody made money after World War II, but like, is there a possible tweak to that narrative that could be helpful? Do you think?
I think God's people have always been kind of on that, not perfectly, mind you, but have always been on the other side of history. The story of the meek, the weak, the weary, um, have something to offer that everybody else doesn't. So, on the one hand, you could talk about this also in the context of the ancient world, that you have history of empires, the Roman Empire, people who are conquerors, who are defeating others by sheer strength. And then you have, by contrast, the Christians, people who are telling stories of weak mothers getting martyred for their faith. And yet these are the stories that somehow win the day. So I think Christianity really has something to offer as a counter narrative to this modern world that seems at times overly, really is overly cruel and devaluing of all persons.
And it seems like, at least in part, that for you resolves in the question of who is my neighbor. Is that fair
Yes,
to say?
I would say so, yes.
Who,
Timeless
who,
question.
who's your neighbor, Nadia?
Well, there are so many here. So on the most obvious level, like I live in this house with my family. So if people call, if somebody wakes me up in the night, guess what I do? I go serve. Um, and and then there is, my neighborhood, my community, my church, so people who are right there. It's really helpful to put a face on your neighbors, and so often in this modern world we have a really hard time putting a face on our neighbors because we just drive everywhere. You don't have to encounter anybody, and yet for those of us who are involved in our community, and especially those who are involved in church, every Sunday you are face to face with other people who may be dealing with all kinds of things, including chronic pain and various other kinds of suffering. And you get to be together, and somehow the world seems so much better as a result.
You may not be saying this, but I'm wondering if you're saying this. Is it helpful to maybe, I guess you would have to artificially do it because the constraints of, I work 50 miles from my
Mm.
house. Do you think there's a benefit to constraining yourself geographically?
Well, if you can, obviously, like sometimes you have no choice. Like, I don't know your circumstances. Obviously, there were reasons for you to have to work 50 miles from your house. But in our case, when we moved a year and a half ago, we moved from a small town in Georgia to a small town in Ohio. And we very consciously said, we want to find a church that is no further than 15 minutes from our house because we wanted to go to church with our community. And we did. So that was kind of like, that was really helpful to say, this is what we have to do, this is where we are. And if you can do that, that I think is very helpful. But at the same time, even at your workplace, I would hope that you are able to listen, to minister in whatever ways you can, however your workplace allows.
So I want to run something by you. This was a thought that I just had just kind of puttering around the house today. People like to use the phrase servant leader, I've never really liked it, but I've never really had a reason to not like it. But today I think I landed on why I don't like it. I don't like it because I don't think it's honest about either. I don't I don't think it's particularly interested in serving, and I think it misidentifies leading. It almost seems like um, behave in a way that validates power is what it sounds like. So, and look, my brain goes off in all kind of different directions. So if you're like, no, I don't think that's related. But we're talking about love, and love, I think, is service. And so, do you think there's any validity to that?
It's it's all about the nuances we bring to those kinds of words. Um, I think a lot about the biblical qualifications for elders in Timothy and Titus. Just the whole idea, like, why does a leader in the church, an elder, or a deacon, why does he have to be married to one wife, and why does he have to have children? And I think it's precisely because living day in, day out with really wonderful, really beautiful, but also sometimes really exhausting and exasperating sinners brings out an awareness of the need to serve. Like, especially with kids, you realize this is service. All the jokes are true, that like you haven't experienced parenting until somebody, I don't know, like threw up all over you, for instance, usually at like 2 a.m. So there are all kinds of experiences that um, you are pushed into that you would never willingly choose unless you are a parent.
I like to say love is changing dirty diapers.
Amen. It is.
Look, the baby phase was difficult, but it was
Mm,
also the simplest phase.
mm,
And I realized when my son was a baby and into toddler years, like, oh, this is the healthiest relationship I've ever had,
mm,
because I understand it as like it's my job to love him.
mhm.
He doesn't owe me anything,
Yeah.
and I have to provide for him. He needs me for everything, and I'm not supposed to need him for anything. And I mean, I wonder, does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly the beauty of growth as parents. Like, as a parent, that's how you grow. It's healthy. But that's also what God has in mind for us. So whenever we hear of God as our father, like, that's the beauty of it.
So that leads me to the baby bunny thing. Do you mind explaining what that is for the listeners?
So, some of you may have grown up with Richard Scarry's books, and there's a really sweet story there about a bunny family, and the dad bunny is there, and several relatives, and everybody's asking the sweet baby bunny what he'd like to be when he grows up. And relatives have all kinds of great ideas, like he's going to be a candy maker, he's going to be an airplane pilot, like all kinds of glamorous jobs. I mean, keep in mind, this is like mid-century. Uh, and at the end of the story, we learn that the baby bunny actually has ideas of his own. He is going to have a lot of baby bunnies, and he's going to be a daddy bunny. And it's a really sweet story because it makes you realize, like, this sweet baby is looking around and he's thinking, family is the best thing ever. It's the cheesiest sweet book, and my kids have loved it.
I miss Richard Scarry. I don't think we had any Richard Scarry books for my son, and now he'll be 18 before too long, and so it's yeah, we're past that point. So I noticed a question that, and like I said, I don't treat it as a checklist, but I noticed one that I wanted to get in there. So this idea of love, this idea of Imago Dei, that kind of has a lot to do with human beings, and a thing that I've picked up on since I've been doing the podcast that I always had a sense of is the conversation around good news should probably zoom out and look at creation more, in my opinion. And if you disagree, that's great. Like, I had you on here, you can say whatever you want, but I'm curious, is the frame that you're putting down, is that something that helps us understand all of creation in a good news redemption kind of sense?
I think you could take it that way, although there's also you see in Genesis that there's a hierarchy in creation, that God loves us in a way that he doesn't love, I don't know, every blade of grass. Yes, he created every blade of grass. He loves every little bird out there and so on. But people are the greatest delight in all of God's creation. And that's also just kind of a beauty. Of course, it does obligate us to care for creation, and some theologians have certainly connected the two more than others. And yeah,
So I've been re-listening to the Lord of the Rings books, and I'm not quite there yet, but I know we're gonna arrive in Gondor, and the guy sitting like on the throne is not the king of Gondor, but the steward of Gondor. And so your answer kind of reminds me of, I remember coming across that in the books, and like there's this arrogant guy who's supposed to be doing one thing and he's doing another thing. And I was like, oh, that's what it means. So do you how does stewardship play out if you do say, okay, so we need to take seriously the idea that we're loved and that we should love? Do you see stewardship fleshed out in that way?
I think so. I mean, that seems to be what God is calling us to in the creation narrative in Genesis. The idea of, here's this garden; it's filled with good things. All you have to do is take care of it. But also, the Genesis story reminds us that we've never been perfect at caring for God's creation, because you know what happened when God said, "Here's this garden; take care of it." That's the only job you have, and what happens next? So I think we're continuing on brand and not quite keeping up too well with God's creation. And yet that's still, like, we're still called to steward. Just because we've failed before doesn't mean we stop trying.
So because the book begins with motherhood, and I, we're at a half hour now, and I want to make sure I don't waste too much time, and I want to give you a lot of time to answer the question, what have I left out of the book? But because the book begins with motherhood and childhood, what do we not adequately understand about, and you can answer both or pick one that's more important and talk all day if you want. What do we not understand about motherhood and childhood, do you think?
That they are really beautiful, they are really hard. And just because our society doesn't value mothers and children doesn't mean that our society understands single women either. So it's one of those things that again, I see motherhood, our the flawed discourse in our society around motherhood. I see it as a gateway to see how our society devalues pretty much everyone. So really, the way this book started, perhaps that's a helpful story. Um, I read yet another one of those essays uh, in over Thanksgiving a couple of years ago. How it was actually in Bloomberg, and it had this sensational headline: how women who don't have kids get wealthier or happier or something. Like, it's just um, it was one of those things that I read it and I was thinking, like, I've read so many of these now, and it really has been quite the genre. And each time it's presented as a study, which gives it kind of a scientific whiff. And every time you realize when you read, like, there's no science behind it. And in fact, there has been plenty of science to debunk it, like the work of Brad Wilcox at UVA. So, but why do respectable journals keep publishing pieces um, with the message of motherhood will ruin your life? What does this mean? And what kind of messaging is it giving to mothers in our society? So, so thinking about all of this, I realized that there is a real um, devaluing of personhood, of persons, and what people do as opposed to machines. You know, like, what do you produce becomes kind of the governing question in our world. And when you put it that way, mothers who produce children are producing a product that is not quite as valuable as something else.
Just throw this. Is there a scenario in which someone does not want to be a mother that you would say that's perfectly valid and it's not devaluing? It doesn't have a devalued understanding of motherhood. It just says this isn't what I want.
Absolutely. And that's always been the story in the church. In fact, that was kind of one of those revolutionary things in the early church, the idea that women did not have to get married. I mean, in the ancient world, if you were a freeborn woman, you were expected to get married. You were supposed to produce heirs to the family. That was the one thing you were there for. And in the early church, there was this idea you could be consecrated to God. You could have a holy life that is doing something else, serving the church in a different way. So I'm not saying that every single woman should be a mother. I am, however, quite disturbed by the rhetoric in the liberal media, especially, but really it's kind of everywhere every now and then about how we have too many babies on this planet, which, by the way, like is not true. The overpopulation myth keeps being repeated, but it's a myth. Um, and also just the devaluing of the work of mothers and saying that like women who have kids are going to be miserable. You're going to be poor, miserable, and sick. That's all that children will do to you. That's a really terrible messaging to give young women, and it is false.
So here, I'll throw this recommendation out there for listeners. The podcast "If Books Could Kill" did an episode on the population bomb and and how silly that book was. And I remember learning the population bomb in high school in my environmental science class. We watched the movie, the documentary that they made based on that. So, but sorry, so that's the recommendation. But so you're saying it's specifically the discourse of insisting that women be utilized, I guess, and that could happen in the sense of you will be utilized to reproduce, or you will be utilized for, and I'm putting air quotes, productive economic and civic activity. We'll say, is that fair?
I think so, and there's a lot of new literature coming out. There's, for example, like egg freezing. Did you know egg freezing is through the roof these days? Because all of these companies, like really, really big, um, just competitive companies who hire very like high achieving women are offering as a benefit egg freezing, the idea that like don't have kids when you're too young, when you we need you to work more, but here is we'll pay for egg freezing for you so that when you're in your 40s, if you decide to have a kid, you could. I mean, like that sort of messaging of like be productive because we need you to be productive. So the question is like, for whom are you working? And certainly you're not working for yourself and you're not working for God's kingdom. But there is this messaging that like your career should be your highest good.
Okay, is there something from the book that you were hoping I would ask about that I have not asked about? And I do want to caveat, I try to just send a page of notes or a page of questions. So I have a lot of questions, but I know you don't have all day.
Yeah, I think I can't think of anything really specific. I guess maybe I'll mention the work of Wendell Berry as somebody who, a thinker who was relatively new to me. I only stumbled upon his work a couple of years ago, right as I was starting to think about this book. And I realized that he provided a really valuable voice of life. So the way the book is structured, like I deal with the problems, the modern problems in the first part of the book, like the anatomy of the issue that we see that our modern society is speaking in a really awful way about life, and it comes through in how we talk about mothers and children. And then in the second part of the book, I look at antiquity, pre Christian pagan world, where we see this devaluing also, which is very disturbingly similar to the kind of language that people used to talk about image bearers today, versus early Christianity, where you see a really beautiful new way of talking about people as priceless. And so then in the last part of the book, I bring up a few voices of life. So the question, like, if our discourse is blighted, if we're talking about people in a way that is really not um, respecting their dignity and the beauty of just humanity as God's creation, what would it look like to talk about people as treasures? And so, the final chapter in the book is on Wendell Berry, who has done so much to talk about in a really both in poetry, in novels, but in essays, nonfiction. So thinking about what does it look like to value people, and ultimately what he shows is that it means to value community, because none of us exist in a vacuum. So like the questions you asked earlier, Jared, like what do we say to somebody who's suffering? The answer is community. You are not alone.
Are there books, blogs, YouTube channels, podcasts? You don't have to plug this when you're already on it.
Yeah.
That you would recommend people to get a better understanding of what you're talking about.
One book that I would recommend is Wendell Berry's What Are People For? And then another book that I really love that came out a little before, actually, no, it's been several months now. Catherine Pakaluk's book, Hannah's Children, which is a very different kind of book, and yet gets at the same conclusion that children are something that is delightful and beautiful. Um, she she is an economist, actually, so a very different approach to the same issues that I'm discussing. But she interviewed the 1% of mothers in America. 1% of mothers in America have five or more kids. And so she interviewed several dozens of them and looked at what did they say about this, like this, the cultural messaging that children will ruin your life. Well, these women clearly did not buy into that and chose to have beautiful large families instead. And some of them did talk about suffering, the pain, um, and yet how it's worth it.
Do you think so? Actually, a couple of spots in here, I've
Mhm,
thought of this. I can only speak secondarily,
mhm.
but becoming an adult man, being married, we're about to have a child. I started to learn medicine is not really practiced for women, even when it's regarding women's bodies. It isn't always that concerned with women's bodies. And I know that's not what your book is about, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did bring that up in one chapter, actually, like talking about the experience of going to an OBGYN versus switching to midwife care. Um, one mind blowing statistic I just learned recently, not in the book, but I learned recently that whenever there's a medical advance, it takes 17 years until it's actually implemented in your doctor's office. Can you imagine 17 years? So the way OBGYNs practice, um, it really varies. Like you might get somebody who is up to date on various um, protocols, or you might get somebody who is not. So yeah, without getting too specific about situations that I ran into, um, there were some questionable practices at hand that led me to switch to midwifery care for my younger two children.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't want to leave that
Mhm.
one off because
Yeah.
I figured if it's sending off signals in the back of my head,
Yes.
there may be something to it.
Mhm.
Um, and I knew that you did talk about it in the book. What I'm saying is, I wasn't asking you to give like a full account of medicine in general. What do you read for fun?
Well, I'm a trained classicist, so I do keep going back to ancient Greek and Roman texts. And in fact, I just finished a book on Christians reading classics. Just how can we read those books, like Homer, Hesiod, Greek tragedy, and so on, how we can read those. Um, but also, I read a lot of just kind of eclectic things. So I just recently read a book about the making of Sesame Street in Russian. So the Russian Sesame Street, Muppets in Moscow. It was delightful.
The book is in English.
The book is in English. Yeah.
Okay.
It's about an American journalist who was hired to like direct the Russian Sesame Street in the 90s.
Oh wait, hold on. So it's not Sesame Street translated.
No, no, no.
It's
No, it's her memoir of like working to make the Russian Sesame Street. Go
how well. And maybe you don't know. Was it successful?
She felt like so it ran throughout the 90s, and then Putin shut down the Russian Sesame Street, because he felt like it was a threat to his government, because, everything is a threat to his government. But yeah, it was successful. Just the idea of taking this American concept, but translating it, like not just language, but culture. So they created 3 Russian Muppets that were like original to Russia, which apparently is what Sesame Street does every time they create a show in another country. Did you know there's Sesame Street in like all over the world?
I did not.
I didn't either. And then I read this book. It was, see, like yeah, the craziest, like random reads.
Sesame Street's so cool.
Yeah.
It's funny that I just finished. I read it. I was listening to the audiobook, "The Man Without a Face" by Masha Gessen about Putin. So it's funny that you just got that cold
Yeah.
look on your face. Yeah, he shut it down. It's like, yeah, that checks out.
Yeah.
Anyway, I really appreciate you sitting down with me. Do you have anything else for us?
This is wonderful. Thank you for taking the time.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Next week on the podcast, I will be discussing the book Finding Phoebe with Susan Hyland. Susan Hyland was mentioned in passing recently in my interview with Yi-Jan Lin as an editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature, whom Yi-Jan Lin contacted about the article that we discussed. So here's a preview of my conversation with Susan Hyland. Take care.
There's a lot that we can never know about Phoebe, I guess is what I'll lead with, right? It's not that we can discern if she was married, if she was wealthy, if so, how wealthy was she? But there is a lot we can imagine based on what was historically true, right? And my goal in doing this isn't to try to pin Phoebe down and describe her in a way that is saying historically, here's who Phoebe was, but to say ancient readers of this text certainly had their own culture in mind as they read it, right? So my question is more, who would they have imagined Phoebe to be? What would they imagine to have been the likely thing about Phoebe, right? So I think the most likely thing, and certainly there was variety too, right? So it's not like there's a single answer. But the most likely thing was that ancient readers would have understood Phoebe as the one whom Paul trusted to send with his letter to Rome, right? She's the one carrying the letter. And that's why he introduces her and commends her towards the end of the letter before he starts greeting people who actually live there in Rome. So it's possible that she would have read the letter out loud to the group by naming her as a patron of himself, right? Paul is giving her a certain kind of social standing in introducing her in a way that's saying, hey, this is an important person to me. Take care of her, right? He actually asks them to help her in whatever she might need, right? Whatever her business is in Rome. So I imagine that Phoebe is a person that has some wealth, certainly enough to travel to Rome, right? And she's got a reason to go there.